All right, part 2. Sorry, I got a phone call and it cut me off. But we're going to go back to slide 17. When it comes to the deciduous and the adult teeth, just know the difference. You know, deciduous are the ones that we'll lose, and then we'll have our adult teeth. And then, of course, know what your front teeth are. Those are your incisors, followed by the pointy ones that look like your dog's teeth, hence the word canine teeth. And then your premolars and your molars. That's the way they go. The next slide is looking at, actually, the next slide is talking about the 3 main parts of the tooth, and that is the crown, the neck, and the root, which we're going to look at on the next slide, and also the enamel. And the enamel is the shiny, hard stuff that covers your teeth. It's super duper strong. Your slide says it's the hardest tissue in the body, and that is so that when we bite down on crunchy or hard things, our teeth don't break. But our enamel, we can lose our enamel, and it can get chipped away, and you can feel that with your teeth. So people sometimes have periodontal disease, and that goes away, or just as they get older, or sometimes they don't take care of their teeth, whatever it may be. All right, your next slide is the picture. We have the picture of the crown, which extends above the gum line. And then we have the neck, which is barely extended above the gum line, and then a little bit below it as well, and the root, which is rooted into the gum line. And then it gives you a little bit of a picture of enamel. We're going to come back to everything else here in just a moment. Just follow along in the book, but this is just talking about the main parts. We'll talk about the dentin and the pulp and all that stuff a little bit later. All right, the next slide continues talking about the incisors, the canines, the premolars, and the molars. And those are the ones that we've already talked about. Probably a good idea to remember that your premolars are bicuspid and that your molars are tricuspid. And remember, your molars are farther back. So in this situation, we could use... Actually, we couldn't use that. I was going to say try before you buy, but we can't do that. So premolars are bicuspids. They're the ones who come first. And molars further in the back are tricuspids. It says a set of 20 teeth called deciduous or baby teeth. We talked about those are eventually replaced with a set of 32 permanent teeth. It says adult average to cut first. This is important to remember probably for peds as well later on. Average age to cut the first permanent tooth is 6 years. And the set is usually complete between 17 and 24 years old. All right, your salivary glands. Actually, we skipped an awful lot about that tooth, and I thought we'd be going back, so we're not. Go back up to your picture on slide 18, and let's follow along there, because I don't guess we get any more of that talking about what's inside that tooth. It says in the book, enamel is ideally suited to withstand the grinding that occurs during chewing of the hard, brittle foods. We said that already. And the root and the neck of each tooth are covered in cementum, just like cement. If you wanted something to stay in the ground, you would put cement in it. And cementum's sort of the same thing for your tooth. The center of the tooth contains a pulp cavity that consists of connective tissue, blood and lymphatic vessels, and sensory nerves. The pulp is would hurt if you had a cavity that went down into the pulp. All right, so if they went in there and scraped around the pulp, it's probably going to hurt pretty good. Then we have the neck of the tooth, which is the narrow portion, and we've talked about that. And then the neck is surrounded by the pinkish gingiva or the gum. So when you hear gingivitis, then that's inflammation of the gingiva or the gums. A general term for mild localized and that's gingivitis. There we go. It says it in the book. And then we actually have the root right after that. And you can see around the root that you have the bone. Okay, so you've got your root that is covered in cementum to keep it stuck down into the bone, and the bone covers that, and that would be your jawbone. And that's pretty good for that. It talks about on the next page about periodontitis, which is a generalized term for mouth disease, root disease, gum disease. It says this is an inflammation infection of the membrane and surrounding bone. So just a big general term for having root disease, bone disease in the mouth. And then it talks about dental caries, and that's tooth decay. So most of the time when we see, actually you don't have a picture in here, do you? No, that's malocclusion. And dental caries is almost just kind of like having a big cavity, sort of. There might be a picture in here, but dental caries is usually something that you see as teeth with holes in it, they're rotting, things like that. All right, next slide is salivary glands. Saliva is an exocrine gland. Its secretion flows into ducts. And remember, we talked about that when we did hormones, about exocrine and endocrine glands. Serous top saliva. Serous top means that it's clear. Serous is just clear fluid, okay? It's watery and contains enzymes, but no mucus. And though, remember, anytime we have an enzyme, it's a chemical catalyst. So an enzyme causes a reaction to happen. So in your salivary gland, in the saliva, you're actually going to start the breakdown of food because of salivary amylase, which is the enzyme. It says it's produced by serous top secretory glands, and this is in figure 16.7. Sorry, I got a text message I was looking at. It says 16.7, but I don't really see that in there. So I'm not really sure. I don't see them having that in 16.7. That could be because this is a different book. Produced by serous top secretory glands. I don't see that. I see a 16.8 that looks a lot better, and maybe that's what we're going for. I think it probably is. I just noticed it. So in 16.8, you can see the sublingual gland, the submandibular, the parotid, and the parotid glands, which are all have these secretions. We have mucus top saliva, which is thick, slippery, and contains mucus but no enzymes. So unlike the serous top saliva, which did have enzymes to help break down, mucus does not really break down anything. There's no enzymes there. It's thick and slippery. It helps us lubricate our throat when we swallow. Okay, if our throat was dry, it's much harder to swallow. And it says produced by mucus top secretory cells, and it says 16.7 part B, which I really feel like is supposed to be 16.8. But anyway, we're looking at 16.8 in a minute because 16.7 is your section of a tooth. So, all right, your parotid glands, it has to be because it says 16.7 as well. They're largest salivary glands that produce serous top saliva, and we can get mumps, which is an infection of the parotids. And if you get mumps, then you have all your parotid glands get all swollen up like this, and they're huge, and you have the big mumps, okay? But we haven't seen mumps in quite some time because we get vaccinated. But if you look on 16.8, not 16.7, you'll get a good idea of where your parotid gland. You see the parotid gland and you see the parotid duct. And the duct always means where something flows through. So when we're making that salivary top material, it says it's our largest salivary glands. Then it's going to be made over here in the parotid gland, and the duct is going to release it out into the mouth. Submandibular gland. You can see the submandibular gland down in here, all right? And you can see the duct. Yep, they got the duct labeled, and it comes out here. If you guys ever did that tongue where you can shoot out the saliva underneath your tongue, that is probably coming from your submandibular glands, which is really gross. All right, it says it's a mixed gland. It produces both serous top and mucus top saliva. So the serous top that has the enzymes to helps the breakdown of food, and then the mucus top, which just helps to lubricate everything. It says it's located below the mandibular angle, and the mandibular angle would be down in here. Okay, see this angle? Mandible angle, right down in here. And the ducts open on either side of the lingual frenulum. Remember the lingual frenulum? That little thing right below your tongue that holds your tongue to the floor of your mouth. And there are ducts open on either side. And then we have the sublingual glands. Your sublingual glands, it shows pretty good picture of as well. Sublingual means under your tongue. Actually, that could be the one that will squirt. I'm not really sure. But anyway, the sublingual glands are sublingual under your tongue. They produce only the mucus top saliva, so only the kinds that helps to lubricate. And they have multiple ducts that open into the floor of the mouth. And that is to keep everything lubricated in there. Your next slide, 22, is a good picture of where those glands are. That is in your book as well. And that's the one that this slide keeps saying 16.7, but it's actually 16.8 if you have the new book. I'm not really sure about the old book. All right. The pharynx is the next slide. It says we have 3 anatomic components. That's the nasopharynx, so the part of the pharynx is right behind the nose. Oropharynx is the part that's right behind the mouth. And the laryngopharynx is which comes right above the larynx, which is your voice box. The oropharynx most involved segment in digestion process of swallowing or deglutition. Can't say that word, it's horrible. But I use my oropharynx because when I swallow, hopefully it's not going up to the nasopharynx. Of course it can. We talked about that a little while ago. Sometimes it can come out of your nose. But most of the time when we swallow, it goes to the oropharynx and then down. Regulation of deglution, which movements via the motor cortex and deglution center of the brainstem. That is on page 368 in the new book. It's under pharynx if you're in the old book, under function. It says for the 3 anatomical divisions, the oropharynx is actively the most involved. We already talked about that. And swallowing is also called deglution. First, mastication involves voluntary movements and results in the formation of a ball or a bolus of food. So when I chew and I get that good mouthful of food, it's all chewed up and I'm ready to swallow, that's called a bolus. And that's food and saliva mixed together. It's also moved involuntarily through the oropharynx and into the esophagus and finally into the stomach. Swallowing is a complex process requiring coordination of the pharyngeal muscles and other muscles and structures in the head and neck. Regulation of voluntary swallowing movements is dependent on the nervous impulse originating in the motor cortex of the cerebrum. Involuntary movements are regulated by the impulses originating in the swallowing or the deglutition center located in the medulla or the pons. Medulla and the pons. So all we're saying there is that my brain can allow me to swallow when I want to, but when I swallow, everything that happens there on after, all the movement that happens down in here, that's all regulated, and that's involuntary, regulated by my medulla and my pons in the brain. The next slide is a really good picture of your pharynx, a side view, and I think we had the same one in your respiratory chapter. Next is the esophagus. The esophagus is the next stop in the chain, the alimentary canal, the chute. The esophagus is the muscular, mucus-lined tube that connects the pharynx with the stomach. It is about 25 centimeters or 10 inches long. That's important to remember when you start doing your NG tubes. The esophagus serves as a dynamic passageway for a bolus of food and saliva. And remember, it has to be pretty sturdy. Your esophagus does in most situations, because you take in a lot of food and you eat every day, and sometimes you don't chew it up very good. It can get stuck there, and that's horrible. That happens to some people quite often. As a matter of fact, I actually knew one guy who had a bolus of food stuck there, and it tore his esophagus. But theoretically, it's pretty strong in most situations. It says we have an upper esophageal sphincter, and sphincters are very important because sphincters are little things in your digestive system. Actually, sphincters could be anywhere. When we talk about a sphincter is something that can be involuntary or voluntary, but it allows the passage to the other side or keeps the other side from backing up. Okay, so this says I have an upper esophageal sphincter, and we probably have a picture of it. We do. I think it's in a couple of slides. Actually, on figure 1610, you can see a picture of the lower esophageal sphincter. So at the bottom of, actually you can see the lower one, but I don't see the upper one. The upper esophageal sphincter helps prevent air from entering the tube during respiration. So when I breathe, then I'm not taking all that air into my esophagus down to my gut. I'm taking it into my trachea, into my lungs. Okay, so that sphincter is there to keep the air going the right way and not going down into my gut. My lower esophageal sphincter, which you do see a picture of on where it says the stomach, I don't know exactly which, probably 1610 in the new book and maybe 16:9 in the other, but you see a picture of the stomach, and at the bottom of the esophagus, where the esophagus meets the stomach, you're going to see the lower esophageal sphincter, and that's to keep food into the stomach and not coming back up into your esophagus. We also call that the cardiac sphincter. And you may have heard of the cardiac sphincter It's called that really, and this is where we get heartburn. It's the cardiac sphincter, but if it backs up and it causes indigestion or stomach acid to go up into your esophagus, we typically call that heartburn. And I lost my place again. All right, so we're on stomach on slide 26. The stomach, it says it expands after a large meal about the size of a sausage when empty, which is pretty small, but think about all the things that we could put in there, right? Absolutely. Food enters the stomach through the cardiac sphincter, and that's what we talked about before. After it leaves the esophagus, it will go through the cardiac sphincter or the lower esophageal sphincter, same thing, into the stomach. And that sphincter is supposed to not allow the gastric contents to come back up into the esophagus, but we know sometimes that happens and we get heartburn. The pyloric sphincter muscle closes an opening between the pylorus and the duodenum, and you can see that actually on that figure 2 where we saw the lower esophageal sphincter. Let's see here. See what else we're missing here. Quite a bit. Let's see. The 3 divisions of the stomach are shown below are the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. The fundus is the enlarged curving base to the left and above the opening of the stomach. The pylorus is its lower narrow apex section, which joins the first part to the small intestines. And the upper right border of the stomach is known as the lesser curvature, and the lower left is the greater curvature. The stomach looks small when it is empty, but it's much bigger than a large sausage, so it expands easily to food. And Actually, I don't think we need anything else right there. We can go on to the next slide. I think it covers it in the next one. It does. There's the wall. The wall of the stomach has many smooth muscle fibers. Contractions produce churning movements. So when we eat, of course, we have our digestive juices and our enzymes, our hydrochloric acid that are help to break down all the food and get it ready to start passing through the rest of the canal. But we do have contractions in there as well, so it can churn the food and the digestive juices together. So the wall has to be pretty tough of my stomach in order for that to happen. The lining of your stomach, it says, is a mucous membrane. And we want that because we need mucus. Mucus is protective, remember. So we need that stomach lining to produce mucus to protect it from itself. It has many microscopic glands that secrete gastric juice and hydrochloric acid into the stomach. Mucous membranes lie in folds called rouge when stomach is empty. So if everybody's any seen of rouging on a dress, it looks like folds, all right? It kind of does like this. This is like rouging, all right, when you fold it up and you have ruching, okay? Same thing happens with your stomach. So when it expands, then those folds can get bigger. See, I can do this. Now, if I expanded it, look, I have no ruching. But when my stomach's empty, it'll come back together and ruche up like that, those little folds. The next slide, 28, is a picture of the stomach. You can see the fundus, the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter or the cardiac sphincter. You see the pyloric sphincter. Remember, a sphincter is to keep things from backing up. And you see that pyloric sphincter is right at the end of the pylorus in that pyloric section of the stomach. And that pyloric sphincter is the sphincter that keeps things coming back up from the duodenum back up into the stomach. All right, your small intestines. Let me find where that is in the book so we can cover that. Oh, we need to take a step back and talk about chyme, or chyme, however you want to say it. It says in here, the muscle fibers that run, this is under structure of the stomach. The muscle fibers that run lengthwise around and obliquely make the stomach one of the strongest internal organs, well able to break up chunks of ingested food into tiny particles and mix them thoroughly with gastric juice. And we talked about that churning. And with that end product is called chyme or chyme, depends on who you are. All right, before we go, I do that every time. Before we go on to the small intestine, we want to make sure we're looking at the function as well. A couple of terms I want to go over there is GERD, and that's reflux, gastroesophageal reflux disease. And we talked about that when you have continual reflux of your stomach secretions up into your esophagus. We call that heartburn. If you have that over and over and over and it's chronic, we'll call that GERD. It also talks a little bit about a hernia. And a hernia is any time you have an organ that protrudes into the wrong body cavity. And this says there's a bulging at the end of the esophagus and a part or even all of the stomach upward through the diaphragm into the chest. And this is called a hiatal hernia. So my stomach, excuse me, my stomach and my esophagus should be right where they are. They should not be moving. They have their own body cavity to live in. But when they start to protrude up through my diaphragm, remember my diaphragm separates my thoracic cavity from my gastrointestinal cavity. When those things start to protrude up into my diaphragm, then I can have something called a hiatal hernia. All right, now we can go to small intestine on page 29. It says it's about 20 feet long, but only 2 centimeters or so in diameter, for very small. So that's why we call it the small intestine. It's divided up into the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. On slide 30, you can see a little, actually you can't. You can see a little bit. That's actually going to talk about the layers of the small intestine, so we'll come back to that. It says, going back to the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, to accommodate such a long tube within a relatively short abdominal cavity, it must be coiled into many loops. Thus, a small body cavity can contain a long tube with a large surface area. Most of the chemical digestion occurs in the first subdivision of the small intestine, or the duodenum. Very important to remember that. The duodenum is a C-shaped and curves around the head of the pancreas. The acid chyme enters the bulb of the duodenum from the stomach, and this area is the site of frequent ulcerations, or duodenal ulcers. The middle third of the duodenum contains the openings of the ducts that empty the pancreatic juices out and bile from the liver into the small intestine. The 2 openings are located in the 2 bumps called the minor duodenal papillae and the major duodenal papillae. And you really don't have a great picture of that, do you? Nope. Occasionally a gallstone blocks these ducts and the drains from the duodenal papillae, causing the symptoms such as severe pain, jaundice, and digestive problems. So I need those things to empty out into my gut. Remember, those are your liver, your pancreas, and your gallbladder are all accessory organs to my digestive system, and they produce certain enzymes and bile, okay, that need to empty out to help me to digest all foods, and it help me with digestion. So if I get a blockage in one of those areas where, like say the gallbladder should empty, then I'll have a backup. I won't have any bile in my digestive system, in my alimentary canal per se. It'll get backed up into my gallbladder, and then I'll have a gallbladder problem, and I'll end up with gallstones and an inflamed gallbladder. And actually, we do have a picture. It's on the next, actually, let me see here. It's a few slides down, and we'll come back to it. The small intestine, we have the wall that contains the smooth muscle fibers that contract to produce peristalsis and segmentation. This is under function, maybe? I don't even see it in here. Let me see. I don't even see it. And then we have the lining. And remember whoops. Sorry. All right. So the lining is, of course, a mucous membrane. Remember, the whole alimentary canal has mucous membrane lining, and because mucus is protection. Many microscopic glands secrete intestinal juice, and the villi are microscopic finger-shaped projections from the surface of mucosa into the intestinal cavity and contain blood and lymph capillaries. We see that. I do see that. That is under function. Under function, it talks about it says several structures or features of the lining of the small intestine make it especially well suited to absorption of nutrients and water, including multiple circular folds called the plicae. These folds are covered with thousands of little villi that can be seen projecting into the lumen of the intestine. Inside each villus lies a rich network of blood capillaries that absorb the products of carbohydrates and protein digestion, and lymph capillaries that absorb lipids. Millions and millions of villi just inward from the mucus lining, jut inward from the mucus lining. This large absorptive surface area allows faster absorption of nutrients from the intestines into the blood and lymph. Very important that you remember that most of my nutrient absorption comes from the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. Very important, okay? Liver and gallbladder is next. The liver is the largest gland. It fills up the right section of the abdominal cavity and extends over into the left side. Most of the liver is hidden or protected by the right rib cage. And you'll be able to feel, if you were to palpate for the liver, you could feel the outer edge of it, but you shouldn't feel the whole thing. If you are feeling the whole thing, then your liver is probably swollen for some reason. That means usually a sick liver. Liver excretes bile, and we're going to talk about that, how it gets out into, we talked about a little bit about your gallbladder, but we're going to talk more about it now. It said the liver is so large that it fills up the upper right section of the abdominal cavity. We said that because its cells secrete a substance called bile into ducts, the liver is classified as an exocrine gland. In fact, it is the largest. The liver also serves as an excretory role because it removes yellowish bile pigments formed by the breakdown of hemoglobin from old red blood cells. So I want you to remember that, because if those things get backed up, remember it said they're yellow, if they get backed up, then we can usually see that outwardly. People might turn yellow, called jaundice. It puts it takes these bile pigments, these old bile pigments, out of the hemoglobin from old red blood cells and puts them into bile for elimination from the body. The liver also has a wide variety of metabolic functions, and we'll talk about that next chapter, it says. Look again at the figure 1612 and identify the hepatic ducts. They drain bile out of the liver, a fact suggested by the name hepatic, which comes from the Greek word liver. Next, notice the duct that drains bile into the small intestine is the common bile duct. The liver continuously secretes bile. If there was no chyme in the duodenum, then circular sphincter muscles within the duodenal papillae remain closed, and the bile backs up the common bile duct into the cystic duct, which leads to the gallbladder. The folded lining of the gallbladder allows it to expand and thus act as an overflow reservoir for bile. All right, so what you need to take from that piece of the text is, one, that your liver creates bile. Bile is a enzyme needed for digestion. Sorry, I got another text now. I was just looking. Bile is a enzyme, a chemical needed for digestion. And remember that my liver has to secrete those things out. They need to get rid of the bile, because I don't want, if I get that backed up, then I'm going to have a backup in my liver and a backup in my gallbladder, and I'm going to have some very serious problems. And it says here it serves as, when it talks about the yellowish bile pigments formed by the breakdown of the blood, those have to be emptied out into my digestive tract so I can eliminate those through my feces. That's very important. And if I don't do that, and all those bile pigments get backed up because my body cannot excrete them into my feces, then I'm going to end up with a condition called jaundice. And that's where the yellow pigment actually starts to come out in my skin and the whites of my eyes and my mouth. It's because my body could not rid those things. My body has to break down those old red blood cells. You remember, red blood cells die. And when they die, then they have to go somewhere, all right? And I need to flush them out, and I need to get rid of them through feces. And that's why with a lot of babies, mothers who breastfeed typically have, sometimes, more often than a bottle baby, have babies who end up jaundiced because they're not pooping a lot, because they're not getting a lot of breast milk yet. They're just getting colostrum milk. First little bit of milk you get in the first 2 days. So breast babies a lot of times get jaundice because they're not moving feces. They're not getting a lot into their gut. And remember, the book says that if you do not have chyme or chyme, however you want to say it, and remember, chyme is the product of saliva and the churning of foods in my stomach, and it makes up that mixture. If I do not have that in my small intestine, then the area will close and I will not secrete bile. All right, so if I don't have food going through, then I'm not going to secrete bile and I'll get a backup. All right, liver and gallbladder continued. The gallbladder is right underneath that. It says the liver continuously secretes bile. If there is no comment that we said that, then the duodenum, then a sphincter closes and I will not put out bile into my small intestine. Instead, it will go to an overflow called the gallbladder. And my gallbladder, again, is stores bile produced by the liver in case I can't use it at that time. So if I get a backup there too, or if the chemicals change in my gallbladder, I can end up with gallstones as well. And the gallstones can cause you to have a removal of the gallbladder. So if I have my gallbladder removed, then I don't have that overflow reservoir anymore. So there's nowhere for that extra bile to go, but except in my small intestine. So these people a lot of times will have quite a bit of diarrhea if they eat fatty foods or something like that, but that's a med-surg topic. We'll talk about that some other time. Next picture on slide 34 is a picture of your small intestine wrapping around the pancreas and then the gallbladder above it. And you can see the ducts, follow the ducts, and you can see how the pancreas, you can see the liver, and how all those ducts just empty out into each other until everything ultimately empties out into the small intestine. Make sure you see that common bile duct. That common bile duct is the biggest one, and you can see that the bile comes from those two small little hepatic ducts up under, it says right and left hepatic ducts. That's where the bile is coming from the liver. And then it's going to go straight down that large tube called the common bile duct, and it's going to go empty out through to my small intestine. And then if I have a backup there, you can see that my reservoir is over to the left, and that is the gallbladder. That's my backup reservoir for bile. And I guess we'll come back to that for, actually pancreas is next. So we'll come back to this picture. Let's talk about the pancreas. Your pancreas is an exocrine gland that lies behind the stomach, and we saw a picture of that in slide 34. Pancreatic cells secrete pancreatic juice. It's the most important digestive juice, and you need to remember that. People who have pancreas problems don't make that digestive enzyme, so they have to have it sprinkled on their food. And that's very important to remember. Very important. These pancreatic juices empty into the pancreatic ducts. The main duct empties into the duodenum. You have the pancreatic islets, or the islets of Langerhans. These cells not connect with pancreatic ducts, and they secrete hormones, glucagon, and insulin. And we'll talk about, I think we've already talked about that. Remember your A cells and your B cells, your alpha and beta cells in your pancreas. The alpha cells are what secrete glucagon, which is your sugar, your natural sugar. And then your beta cells in your pancreas secrete your insulin. So what we want to take from the pancreas is that it secretes the pancreatic juice, which is the most important digestive secretion that you have. My phone's getting low, so I got to plug it in. And people who do not have that pancreatic enzyme, that pancreatic juice, if they have pancreatic problems, then they will have to have a different, they'll have to have the pancreatic enzymes given to them through food or something along those lines. Let me see if this will flip. Good. All right. Hopefully this works, because I had to flip upside down so I could charge. Nope, I don't think it's going to work. We'll have to figure it out like this. Maybe. All right, let's hold it like this. We'll do the best we can. All right. The large intestine, going on slide 35. The large intestine is divided into... Oh, you know what I actually want to do? Actually, you can. Just go back up to the slide on 34 and look at the pancreas and look at the pancreatic ducts and how they empty into the small intestine. Remember, all the things that we talked about, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, they all serve different reasons. They all serve different purposes for digestion, and they all eventually end up into the small intestine. So liver, again, liver's going to secrete bile, and that bile is going to go in to mix with chyme when the chyme is available. It's going to help with digestion and nutrient absorption. And then if it backs up, it goes to the gallbladder. And then my pancreas has that super important pancreatic enzyme needed for digestion. Okay, and they all via some sort of duct. Okay, remember, duct is always the little tubes like a duct work in the house. If I had heat or air going on outside into the big system, duct work is what's going to push it out into the house. Same thing for ducts in your body. Your large intestine, going back to it, its divisions are the cecum. And the cecum is the very first part, and we're going to have a picture on the next slide to look at that. Your cecum starts right, it's the portion, the very beginning, the first part of your large intestine. And then we have what we actually call the colon, and the colon is broken up into 4 parts. Remember, ascending colon is the part of the colon that goes up. Transverse is the part that lays to the side. Transverse means to lay on the side. Descending is the part that goes down. And the very bottom part is the sigmoid colon that leads to your rectum. It says food enters through the ileocecal valve. That is on page, let me see if I can find it. Yes, it's on the page in the new book 375 under large intestine structure in the old book, whatever page that may be. I don't even know where that book is. There's so much chaos in this house. But it says chyme containing undigested and unabsorbed material enters the large intestine after passing through the sphincter called the ileocecal valve. And remember, sphincters are designed for things not to back up. So it's leaving the bottom part of my small intestine through the ileocecal valve, going to my large intestine into the cecum. Chyme, which has the consistency of soup, changes to the more solid consistency of fecal matter as water and salts are reabsorbed during passage to the small intestine. Huge to remember that my large intestine is going to, my intestines are going to draw a lot of water. Okay, so in the very beginning, it's very soupy-like, but the longer that it sits in my intestines, the more water is going to be absorbed, and salt. And remember, they follow each other. Water follows salt. So the longer it sits in my intestine, the more formed and firm stool that I have. It is the paste-like material that passes through the valve into the large intestines, and then the subdivision of the large intestines are listed below. Note in figure 1614 that the ileocecal valve opens into a pouch-like area called the cecum, the first part of your large intestine. And the opening itself is about 5 or 6 centimeters long, or 2 inches. Material in the cecum flows upward to a region of the large intestine called the colon, and then we have it broken down. Let's see here. We have ascending. Material moves into the colon on the right side of the body into the ascending colon. This is after I've went through the cecum, then the ascending and the transverse. Actually, moving backwards here. We're starting with ascending now. We're just now talking about it. Material moves into the colon on the right side of the body into the ascending colon. The hepatic flexure, or the right colic flexure, is the bend between the ascending colon and the transverse colon, which extends across the front of the abdomen. And then we go to the splenic flexure, or the left colic flexure, which is the bend that goes from transverse to descending colon. I'm not going to ask you those flexure names, but do know that there is a name where it starts to bend, okay? You don't really need to know that for this test, but you do need to know that it goes from cecum to ascending, transverse, descending, and then sigmoid. It says the sigmoid colon is the S-shaped segment that terminates in the rectum, and the termination portion of the rectum is called the anal canal, which ends at the external opening, or the anus. The wall of the large intestine contains smooth muscle fibers that contract, producing churning, peristalsis, and defecation. I need my large intestines to work because it's actually what's going to push things all the way down so I can go defecate. And then, of course, it's lined in a mucous membrane because mucus is protective. Your next slide shows a really good picture. Okay, you can see where the ileum, okay, which is the last part of your small intestines, opens up into your cecum. via the ileocecal valve. And remember, in my ileum, or in my small intestines, I've absorbed a lot of water and salt. So as it's moved through the small intestines, I've now got a mushy kind of consistency emptying out. And as it goes to the large intestines, I'm going to absorb more as well. And that way, when it comes out, it's usually formed for most people. So my ileum, of course, is the bottom section, once again, of my ascending colon. And then the ileocecal valve is prevent reflux, emptying out into my cecum, which is that little pouch-like with the variform appendix at the end, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then from there, via peristaltic movement, it's going to go to the ascending colon through that flexure or that bend, through my transverse colon through another flexure or bend, and down my descending colon until I see the sigmoid colon at the bottom, which is kind of the S-shaped. The sigmoid colon is going to empty out into the rectum, and then it'll come, whatever's in the rectum will come out the anus eventually. Your variform appendix is the worm-like tubular structure that is hanging off of the cecum. It says in your book, vermis means worm. As the name implies, it's a worm-like tubular structure. The appendix contains a blind tube-like interior lumen that communicates with the lumen of the large intestine. It's about 1 inch long. The appendix serves as a sort of incubator or breeding ground for the non-pathogenic intestinal bacteria found throughout the colon. Besides the normal functions, maintaining a normal intestinal microbiome, helps to prevent pathogenic bacteria from becoming established. When the normal microbiome of the gut is disrupted by infection or antibiotics, for example, beneficial bacteria hidden in the appendix can migrate to the colon. Okay? And that's all you have in the book, really, and that's all you really need to know. It doesn't really help you with any kind of digestive system. It doesn't help you digest anything. All it does is give you some really good bacteria in the gut if you need it. And, of course, you can live without your appendix. Lots of people have their appendix out. Because it is a breeding ground there, I think sometimes it gets confused and it gets irritated and it can rupture. If it ruptures, it can cause quite a bit of problem into your gut, into your... I'm sorry, I keep getting text messages. All right, I'm going to stop this one and then have to upload a third one. I think it's getting a little bit too long.